Hello, I'm Nate. I Am Jay is a 2011 novel about the eponymous Jay, who's coming of age while also being transgender, by Chris Beam. So, firstly, I'm going to spoil most of this book while I'm talking about it, and secondly, there's a lot of things in this book I'm not going to mention just because they aren't part of the central themes of the book and aren't really relevant to the plot or characterization. So, if there's something else that you wanted me to talk about that I didn't talk about, I'm sorry. But it wasn't relevant. Also, this is marketed as a book about being a transgender teen, so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on. And lastly, I didn't want to edit me just basically reading the book word for word, so I'm not going to do that. I keep going back and forth on this book. I really didn't like it the first time I read it, and then when I was rereading it for research, I kept going, well, actually, there's a lot of stuff in here that's really relevant to the topic at hand, and then back and forth during the book, I just kept going, actually, no, I hate this book, and so on and so forth. I don't actually have a physical copy, like a real YouTube reviewer. I just have my Kindle, so that's the cover. So that's the cover in the only lighting that I could get it to show its face in. And though I don't have a physical copy, I did make some notes. Just like a few things. I'm going to go over the major characters and the major themes first. So starting off, we have Jay, who's the main character. Jay's basically the worst. Jay's super judgmental of everyone he comes into contact with, even people who are being kind to him, has a lot of homophobic and transphobic thoughts toward others, and also sexually assaults his best friend at one point in the book. And to add insult to injury, he says later to that same character that he sexually assaulted the phrase, "not all men," out loud. His friend Melissa would be a manic pixie dream girl if he was a straight nerdy guy, but instead she's a dancer and a self-harmer, and those are her two big personality traits that she has. Other than that, she is an empty shell. And also there so that Jay could sexually assault her. Then we have Jay's parents, Carolina and Manny, who are the worst. All you need to know about Carolina is she is the worst. Manny's almost the worst. He's the second worst. I guess terrible children don't fall far from the terrible parent acorn tree. Other notable characters include Chantel, who is too good for this world, and Blue, who has never done anything wrong in her life. So the big themes, in no particular order, are art, self-harm, homophobia and transphobia, and lastly, relationships that are bad. I would say abusive relationships, but some of them are just terrible people who have no reason to be friends with each other, but still are. So just for fun, I'm going to tell you what the sticky notes mean. Purple, which you might be able to see here and there, are the instance of art being used as a major theme. Blue is homophobia or transphobia. Green is abusive relationships or just bad relationships. Yellow is self-harm, and as you'll notice, there is an additional color that I did not mention as a theme, and red is just instances of Jay being a huge dick. As far as the plot goes, Jay runs away like 3 times, meets some people that he lies to, and then stop talking to him, goes to a school for at-risk LGBT youth, and then moves out of his parents' house when he kind of pseudo gets kicked out, kind of doesn't, and starts his transition and coming out. In the end, it's just him getting accepted to college and also getting testosterone. You would think in a book that was mostly an internal struggle that there would be some sort of arc or learning that the character does, but the book is almost entirely written for cis people to try to maybe understand trans people better, and it doesn't do that. And I'm not saying this is nobody's experience as a trans person, but it's not the experience as a trans person, and Jay's a dick. So, do you want that to be everyone's first example of a transgender person? I don't. His only goal is to transition through the whole book. He has college paid for, he has photography going, which apparently he's really good at, but it doesn't really have any ambitions for. He has friends that are super loyal, even though he's a huge asshole and also sexually assaulted one of them, and she forgives him. So there's that. And really, the conflict at the beginning is that he's transgender, and that's the conflict. And if the story is about him coming out, well, it didn't work out for him, and also he doesn't need his parental consent by the end of the book because by then he's been 18. He doesn't need their help anymore. He also, beyond the testosterone, has no personal goals. His mother pushes him into applying for colleges. His best friend pushes him into trying to get his art in a gallery. A girl he just meets at his new school pushes him into trying to make up with his girlfriend, pseudo-girlfriend at the time. He just doesn't make decisions outside of running away and trying to get testosterone. So let's talk about the themes. Number 1, art. So the big line that they used in this book to illustrate this theme is, "Art is the lie that tells the truth," by Pablo Picasso. Allegedly, that's what they say in the book. I didn't look up if that was true or not. But, yikes. I can see that line being really useful to illustrate a theme if it wasn't about a character study from a trans experience who's also an artist. Every major character that I named earlier, with the exception of Jay's parents, is an artist in some form or another. Jay does photography, which is symbolic of him not having a voice, which is a running line because he doesn't like his voice, like, relatable. But he takes pictures instead to express himself. Chantel writes poetry, which they don't really talk about except for, I think, a sort of a plot point to help Jay write a pseudo-Frankenstein poem for Blue. Blue paints, mostly with blue paints, and expresses a lot of her feelings through what she calls little monsters hidden throughout her paintings. And finally, Melissa dances, both to express herself and to express control over her body, which brings us to our next theme, self-harm. There's some discussion later about how prevalent self-harm is in the LGBT community, but it doesn't really go anywhere and seemed like it was included just sort of like a fun fact, a really depressing fun fact. So we're just gonna put a pin in that. We're gonna put a pin in that. Jay judges Melissa very harshly for her cutting, showing almost no empathy for someone who doesn't realize that most of his actions are led by self-harm. He smokes, talking about enjoying the pain in his lungs, gets into fights for the same reason, whether he wins or loses, he enjoys the pain, has a pretty messed up relationship with a pair of ace bandages, which is also relatable, and is so self-sabotaging sometimes you'd think that he doesn't want to succeed in life. But since he's not actively putting a blade to himself, he thinks he's in the right by judging everything Melissa does. And of course, she shouldn't be doing that, but he doesn't really handle it as delicately as one might handle your best friend self-harming. He just yells at her. This doesn't really go anywhere since Jay never realizes that he's doing this to himself, doesn't have to change or grow as a person around this topic, and Melissa eventually gets forcibly put into a self-harm rehab, which I don't know if those are real or not, but Jay describes it as unfortunate because when Melissa comes back, now she can't stop talking about how good she feels, and it's annoying him. Boy, he's really grown out of that person who kissed her while she was sleeping without her consent. Am I right? The most obvious theme is the homophobia and transphobia throughout the book. Most of this is aimed at Jay, who is constantly being called names by people he does and does not know. His father even goes as far as to call him disgusting. And then Melissa, as soon as he comes out to her, asks to see him naked despite his obvious discomfort with this. The cherry on top of that shit show is when Jay gets physically and verbally assaulted in a subway, which is a very graphic scene that I'm not going to go into detail on here. All of this is terrible and does drive Jay with a lot of his actions and thoughts and feelings, so you'd think maybe he'd have some empathy for other people around him, but no. He doesn't. He gets upset when he's called slurs, but not because people are being homophobic. He gets upset because he gets misgendered by the slurs. In fact, once when he gets called an asshole, he gets pretty happy that he didn't get clocked as trans. When he gets called an asshole, it's because he is one. He's not kind. When he goes to the LGBT school, he immediately distances himself from everyone else, thinking they're cringy and weird, and he doesn't want to be a part of the LGBT culture because they're not normal. Sorry to all those other gays, but I'm different. He's embarrassed to be a part of it, even though the three people who've helped him most, minor characters named Zach and Marcia, and the major character I mentioned named Chantel, all being transgender and all helping him more than anybody else, and being the only people who are completely just kind to him, besides Blue, who did nothing wrong. He really only approves of them because they're normal and they don't act all cringy and weird. So this could work if he grew and learned, which he didn't. He just sort of got absolved from this because he ran away and everyone was like, oh no, don't run away, we're sorry. Or you're not supposed to like him, but as the mouthpiece in a book about being trans, it's not a great look. Or lastly, I could have seen it working if it was an inherently trans experience, but it's not. Speaking of the quintessential trans experience, let's talk about deteriorating relationships with the people that claim to love you but really only love the idea of you as they see you. It's our final theme, manipulative and abusive relationships. I'm going to break this into 3 parts because there's Jay's relationship with his parents, which is entirely their fault. There's Jay's relationship with Blue, which is entirely his fault. And there's Jay's relationship with Melissa, which we'll get into when we get there. So Jay's parents, Carolina and Manny, at different parts in the story almost had me. They almost had me. I almost thought they were good parents because Manny is going to pay for Jay's college no matter what. He's making sure that his child has an education and lets Jay know that whatever he decides to do career-wise, he's there to support him. He's going to pay for his college. Carolina seems real supportive at first when she thinks that Jay's a lesbian. After they talked about it, though, it falls apart. Both the parents fail at the most fundamental step of being a parent, which is unconditional love. Their responses were different, but both very hurtful to Jay coming out. Carolina lying to both Manny and Jay about what the other one thought of them for a long time just to put off her having to talk about it, and also told Jay that he was just creating problems and that this was all his fault, that his dad didn't want to see him anymore, and that he wasn't invited to their 20th anniversary party. And Manny just called Jay disgusting and that he didn't want to see him anymore. Keep in mind, Jay's a kid. He's a teenager. He has no money. He's not living in the same country as any of his other relatives besides his parents. And he's already in pain from what he's going through. And now he has no parents either. This is where the book pulled me back in. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because his parents are just the worst. But there's such a good fine line to walk in between the good memories and good experiences that you have with your parents and terrible things that they say to you, and it's so realistic. It just makes so much sense why Jay's so full of anger and vitriol at everyone, but he still goes back to his parents at the end of the day whenever they let him at the end. He doesn't even live with them anymore. He's above the age of 18 and he lives at his friend Melissa's house, and he still visits his parents on the weekend even though he got kicked out for being trans. Like, that's his happy ending. So when I say that this pulled me back in, it's not necessarily because that the parents are good, because they're not, but it's such a realistic take that parents aren't all either terrible or wonderful. A lot of times they're both. And that really rang true, and I'm sure it will ring true for a bunch of LGBT kids out there. But as we know, this doesn't excuse Jay's poor treatment of others. Let's talk about Blue. So at first, Jay knows 2 things about Blue. 1, she has not clocked him. She thinks he's a cis male. And 2, she likes Jay. He realizes that he's using her much, much later in their pseudo relationship, but it's only after she breaks up with him. And then he's like, oh, well, maybe I was using her. Oh well. And then doesn't think about her again in the whole book. Jay doesn't have anything he particularly likes about Blue. He doesn't think about her outside of that except for what he may or may not be able to do with her physically. He doesn't have any opinions on her as a person, like at all. Now, not being out to someone is understandable. It's not the same thing as lying. But in every other aspect of his life, he lies to her and then is sort of surprised when he goes days and days without talking to her or acknowledging her that she's upset. And at the end, when she breaks up with him, as she should, it turns out that her character was just a lesson to be learned for Jay the whole time. She deserved better. Finally, let's talk about Melissa and her relationship with Jay. So Melissa is Jay's oldest and best friend, the first person who ever stands up for him, and the person that Jay kissed while she was sleeping and then got mad at her for accusing him of kissing her while she was sleeping. Beyond that, everything is complicated. There is no excuse for sexual assault ever, period. That's not what we're discussing in this next portion. So beyond that aspect of their relationship, before that and after that, why are they friends? They're just two stupid, self-absorbed people using each other out of duty or routine, or in Jay's case, the hopes that maybe he'll get into Melissa's pants one day. Seriously, anyone else who's also read this book, please tell me a redeeming quality of either of them, or why they're friends. I get why Jay wants to hang out with her at first. He doesn't have any other friends. But she's shown to have a very active social life and multiple different boyfriends that Jay can remember and be salty about. And then later in the book, Jay gets his own other friends, and they all seem to get along way better than Jay and Melissa do. And like, Jay's such a turd. Melissa at least has passions and ambitions outside of Jay. Jay just wants that testosterone, and that's it. That's his character. The only thing they seem to be getting out of this after the sexual assault is that Melissa feels bad, so she initiates platonic cuddling and tells him if he were a real boy, she'd be into it. Like, if these were real people, they would deserve our pity and also a lot of therapy, but they're not real. They're champions for my cause. So, is it a good story? And is it good representation? I think it's mixed. Oh, what's this? What's this? Responsible and representative portrayal of LGBT issues. So Jay's internal struggle can feel really honest, but it can also feel so angry and unkind that you really don't have any sympathy for him after that point. Like, he's also a hypocrite. He hates being called aggressive because people who are calling him aggressive are using it as like a stereotypical butch lesbian sort of insult, but he is aggressive. He sexually assaults someone, and two, he's always picking fights because he likes to feel pain, because he's an edgelord. He's just, even in his head, is viciously unkind. At one point, I think one of his neighbors says hello to him, good morning, and uses the wrong name because he hasn't talked to her in years, and he's just like, ugly fat cow. However, I think the representation as far as everyone else's reaction around him, the way that cis people and trans people will react differently to a trans person, and the way people in the LGBT community will speak differently, it's handled really well in this, as opposed to Jay, who is, the main character and mouthpiece and the character of the character study. But, it did do a good job of the other stuff. I'm going to end with a few notes and then my final verdict. Number one, this story was written by Chris Beam, who is a cis man, although he has worked with the LGBT community for years before the book was published in 2011, has a transgender daughter, and I believe came to this with the best of intentions. I really think he was trying to provide a story for kids who needed it, and seeing that there was literally no stories at the time for trans boys, he was trying to do the right thing and make it an interesting story at the same time. I just feel like the story could have been better told by a trans person as opposed to a cis person. Chris Beam, if you're watching this, I think that was a very kind thing to do, and I'm glad that you did it. I just don't like Jay. Number two, outside of the lens of being a trans person and reading the book, it was very technically well written. The themes were well established, and I felt besides me personally not liking the way that art was framed in relation to being trans, outside of that, it was all very well done. It was also pretty slowly paced, which lends itself well to this story, although in some parts it did drag. Overall, it was very well done from a technical standpoint. Lastly, I thought long and hard about why I didn't like Jay. Again, there's no one trans experience, and this experience may not have just resonated with me. So it could be that he was just an angsty teenager dealing with being trans on top of being an angsty teenager like everybody else. But I still don't like him. To finish this all off, I think I've just come to the conclusion that Jay is a teenager. It's hard to be a teenager, and it's even harder to be a teenager who is trans. You know, it's easy. Not sexually assaulting people in their sleep. It's a lot of red there, Jay. There's Blue's relation... Blue's. I still can't see it. And there's Jay's relationship with Melissa,